Capitalism, people will say that it's like fire. It's neither good nor bad. But when you look at the aims of capitalism and the fact that, let's say, you lay off 100 employees, all of a sudden your stock shoots through the roof. There's something immoral about that.
All right, Dan. So welcome to Adrogo Academy. Really appreciate you having me on. And I should say up front, I'm super excited for today's show because what we like to do on this show is really delve deep into topics, understand the nuance and the complexity, and try and get to a better outcome where people not only understand the topic better, but they understand different views on it and how different people think about it. And I think we're going to have a good discussion on that today. So I'll start as I normally do, very high level, just trying to understand from your perspective, what was the objective of the book? Obviously, you put out a lot of content. You're on podcasts like this show here. What's the objective? What's the end goal? What does success look like in terms of what you're trying to get across and communicate?
Well, the book came out of my frustration at trying to get my message out to folks, the next generation, especially about the issues that are they're staring in the face right now and the ones that are going to be there in the future. And I tried running for office, and they say if you're out marching and there's no one behind you, you're just out for a walk. So that's what I was doing. I was out for a walk. And so I decided that I would put this thing into a memoir. And then I realized that people don't necessarily know who the heck I am. So what I needed to do was attach some of the issues of today and of the future that they're going to be dealing with. So it becomes a cautionary tale, gives them some history, and also I sneak in a little bit about myself, and because I'm sort of like that movie Zelig, or even like Forrest Gump, where I'm in the background of historical events, but not necessarily playing a part myself.
No, that makes sense. And so I guess to play that back a little bit. So ultimately there's a message or at least some insights that you have that you think are important for everybody to hear for sure, but particularly the younger generation to understand. And, not to jump to it because I want you to explain it in your own words, but, around capitalism, around some societal issues, I guess the way to put it would be you've had some life experiences where you feel like you've picked up some things, you've learned some things, and for efficiency's sake, for the betterment of all, you think better off if these messages can be taught in a quicker way where people don't have to wait 30 years to understand it. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, that sounds exactly where I'm going. And I developed a study guide to go with my book too, so I could encourage conversation and different viewpoints. Awesome. So I guess let's get to it. The title of the book obviously implies what it is, right? Capitalism killed the middle class. But why don't you, if you could, kind of give the overview of what that means, how you came to that conclusion, and just a little bit of that context. Capitalism, people will say that it's like fire. It's neither good nor bad. But when you look at the aims of capitalism and the fact that, let's say, you lay off 100 employees, all of a sudden your stock shoots through the roof. There's something immoral about that. And whether or not you care to look at it that way, the facts are out there to show that, let's take for what happened in 2008 with the housing bubble.
Sure.
That was based a lot on corporate greed, and they supposedly were doing it to make housing and the opportunity to buy a house available to more people. But the fact was they were selling loans to folks that they knew they wouldn't be able to afford it 2 years down the line. And so a lot of people had to walk away from that. That's some immorality of capitalism. And then we have to come along and fix it. So there comes socialism to the rescue. So there you go.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we talk a lot on this show. We kind of try to be the intersection of kind of philosophy, psychology, sociology, all those things. So right away in that statement you made, it's interesting to me because there's a morality statement in it, right? So you use the example initially of if you lay off 100 people to boost profits, that's an immoral thing to do. And I guess I'll start with this question. I don't necessarily disagree. But I guess where somebody could struggle is to say, well, How do you know that? Like, it depends on your values. It depends on how you define it. It depends on how long your time horizon is. Maybe it hurts those 100 people in the short term, but in the long term, it lifts society through the things it develops. So there's a lot of different ways you can go with it for sure, and we'll get into that. But I guess as a starting point, what's the basis that gives you the confidence to say capitalism in those forms, or maybe in all forms, is immoral? That there's a right and wrong, and that's definitely the wrong way.
Well, it's based on the belief that constant growth is a good thing. But we already realize that there are finite resources like water here in California. Water is a big issue here, and yet we've got fracking going on, using lots of water to bring that shale oil to the surface. Those kinds of issues, to me, if you want to look at them in a non-judgmental way, it's still pretty obvious to me that there are certain things that don't allow us to have a level playing ground. For instance, this whole issue of income inequality is based on the fact that CEOs make over 500 times more than the average employee at their workplace. And those kinds of things, it just adds up. And to me, it would seem pretty obvious that yes, there's an immorality built into the system, and the only way that we're going to resolve that is find a more equitable way of looking at things. And one of my solutions is that maybe labor, organized labor, needs to go back to its roots, which are based in socialism and the fact that if you have success, all boats should rise.
Okay. Yeah, so I get that, and so the idea being that there's a view that inherent in capitalism is that we need to continue to grow. To grow, we need to continue to exploit resources as best we can with the objective, and we're optimizing for growth. We're not optimizing for people's well-being. We're not optimizing for protecting those resources, et cetera. So I think that makes sense. And you started to get to this, so I guess let's go this way with it. What does the solution look like? What is, assuming we agree to that, that's kind of not the right way to do it. What is the practical solution in your mind? If you were king for a day, or if you had the magic wand, what would you like to see changed?
Well, I'd like to see, and this is the premise of my book, even though it's kind of hidden between the lines, the labor movement can actually be the salvation of the middle and working classes, just by the fact that because of our social roots, we can be a counterbalance to unfettered capitalism. So the PRO Act is one ideal situation I see coming up out of Congress. If you pass the PRO Act, which is protecting the right to organize, that's what PRO stands for. It allows a more level playing field. You don't have employers taking their employees into these meetings and browbeating them into saying that you don't need the union because it's a force that will come between us, when actually it's a force that advocates for the worker.
Would you go as far to say that, because there's a power dynamic there, right? Which I think you're getting at. And right now, hard to argue the fact that the power dynamic is very much in favor of the elites or the corporations and the like, the wealthy. Would you go as far to say that power dynamic in an ideal world, in your world, it should do a 180, it should shift to where the power dynamic sits with the workers? Or is it more about leveling the playing field so that there's kind of a fair give and take between both sides?
Well, to tell you the truth, the New Deal, the establishment of the National Labor Relations Board by FDR back in the 40s leveled that playing field, and that's great. But when he died, Eleanor found his widow found herself fighting to keep those rights for workers that had leveled that playing field, and they came up with something called the Taft-Hartley Act. And there's a section in there, I think it's 14B, that establishes the right to work, which is anything but the right to work. It allows corporations to create those meetings where you're browbeating your employees, and you're not having to pay dues. So that takes money away from the union that would be there to negotiate on your behalf and mediate grievances and things like that. It pulls the rug out from under them. So that was their vengeance for the New Deal and the Labor Relations Act. So what has transpired since has been pretty one-sided. I talk about something called the Powell Memo. The Powell Memo was written in 1971 by Lewis Powell, who was a lawyer for the tobacco companies when they were saying that tobacco was not addictive. And he was asked by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to create this document that took away the conversation away from the Vietnam vets that were coming back and all the protesting that was going on about the Vietnam War and about the capitalist system at the time. And so he came up with this whole plan about how business could take back the conversation through using think tanks and going into colleges and basically just making everything about capitalism and about big business being this great savior of democracy. But Nixon was so impressed, he appointed him to the Supreme Court. And so what we've got to do is take that conversation back and put regular working people back in the driver's seat.
Yeah, and I asked the question because there's a theory I have, which is just that. It's just a theory. I don't claim to be an expert or know any of this. I just like to explore it and try and think through it. But that, I mean, I guess if I had to say, it's somewhat in line with survival of the fittest. But this idea that there's always power dynamics at play, right? In every relationship and everything that happens in all the systems and the structures we have in the world, there's power dynamic. That's just a natural law, if you will. So if you believe that, you can kind of follow that logical thread and say there's always going to be somebody who's in power, and human nature is to exploit that power, right? It's not to say some people haven't been able to overcome that and there's not good people in the world. But at aggregate, human nature is if you have power, you retain it, you exploit it, you use it to serve yourself. So I say that because back to the topic we're talking about, you can see an argument being made that if you shift the power dynamic and say, hey, the corporations, the elite, they've abused that power. We shouldn't allow that. We give it back to the workers. You run into a situation where maybe the workers do the same thing. They get the power and now they use it. They exploit it. They use it for their own gains, whatever that might be. Just curious your take on that kind of philosophical framework, if you agree with that or if there's holes in that I might not be seeing.
That's a very Darwinistic way of looking at things. And I wish that were true, and that's why I'm more amenable to having a level playing field where either one has an advantage because everybody has something they bring to the party.
Do you think, I mean, I guess you do, so I guess I'll just ask you to expound on it. People that do think in the more Darwinistic way, that's just how animals are created and it's instinctual in our nature. I guess what you're saying is that's not true. There is a world in which we can all live where we aren't looking to win. We aren't looking to get power. We're not looking to protect ourselves at the expense of others. Is that right?
Yeah, and I understand it's kind of human nature to want to have the upper hand, but if we're going to accomplish anything, we need to work together.
Do you worry at all? Because this is what I hear. I get into these, you might not be surprised to hear, get into these conversations a lot. And I tend to just play devil's advocate because I'm trying to figure it out for my own head. Sure. And one of the things I hear when I go the approach of exactly what you're saying is that people say like, yep, that's great. And I wish that were true, but we just can't trust people to do that, right? For that to work, you need everybody to actually be bought in and to everybody to kind of follow the rules, if you will. And if you start to get bad actors that break the rules, somebody's always going to suffer. So if somebody's going to suffer and somebody's going to win, and that's just what it is, I may as well try and be on the right side of that.
Yeah, and I understand that argument, but I also think that with unfettered capitalism, if you let the situation run its course, there's going to be some bodies laying along the way. So I think that one of the things that we can do with government, and I know this is going to go against anything libertarians have to say, with government acting as a robust, with robust oversight, we can avoid some of those pitfalls that you're talking about, where one side tries to gain advantage over the other.
Yeah.
There's a chapter on that in my book called workplace power, and it talks about the stockholder, the consumer, the CEO, and the worker, and about that whole dynamic, and how it's going to, if it's one-sided, and in these four stools, so to speak, four legs of the stool, then the others are going to suffer. So I'm all for this thing that we call democratic socialism, I guess.
Yeah. No, and there's certainly, as you've said, there's lots of evidence to suggest that capitalism is obviously not perfect, and there's lots of damage done by it. So I think anybody being reasonable would have a tough time arguing that point. Does it concern you at all when the solution is the government, right? Again, you mentioned libertarians, so let's go with that argument for a while, where someone from that camp might say, well, why would you trust the government? I agree with everything you're saying. We need to regulate this. We need to keep things in check. We can't just let a group of people make decisions unfettered. But I have no faith in the government being able to be that enforcing mechanism or the one to fix this thing. They just become another aspect of the power dynamic, and they're going to serve their own interests.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Terry. But I think that all these working in concert with each other make a fundamental difference in the way that we handle these kinds of issues. Japan is a prime example of being able to have all the working parts there, and everybody pushing together for the betterment of society. Japan has made so many great leaps and bounds since they were looking at defeat after World War II. And in fact, a friend of mine, a Hungarian friend of mine, said he was on a fishing trip with a German and somebody, Japanese person, and they were laughing about the fact that America has to keep this army and forces posted throughout the world, and how that's a drain on our economy, while they get to explore all sorts of things economic that we don't have an opportunity to do because we're so busy patrolling the world.
Yeah. And I think it's a good one. If you could, because for some people, they might not be aware, right, of Japan. They may hear some things Japan is doing or how they work. But from a high level, like what are the things you think that they're getting right? What are the things that you think they've realized or been able to make work that we haven't here?
Well, one of the funny things I've heard about is that they pay union dues on the robots that they use in their car production and things like that. And I think that's one way to whether we can equalize things. And it's just their way of life. It says that you're here for the good of your fellow Japanese person, and that's what we're missing. We've moved so far into it's all about me that we need to get back to it's all about us. And Bernie Sanders was great at that point, and he has inspired a lot of millennials who are now looking at things in a much more egalitarian sort of way.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think too. I was reading a book recently by a gentleman named Adam Grant. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a Wharton professor, but he's a psychologist and kind of organizational psychology. And he talks a lot about how people think and why, in some ways, there's so much polarization today. And one of the things he says is that one of the problems is that we've made things too binary, right? It's either you're pro-capitalism or you're pro-socialism, and there's no in between. And when you make it just two issues, it becomes really hard to get to the best solution. So I wonder, in that vein, if as you think about that, is it that simple? And it might be in this case, right? It might very well be. Is it that simple that socialism is really is the answer, or is there some Frankenstein combination view that we haven't figured out yet, that it's not capitalism is completely bad? There's good aspects, just like with anything. What's your thought on that?
It's democratic socialism that's going to work, because it is a combination of the two philosophies, I guess you might call it, because it allows for private ownership, while at the same time you've got the oversight that you need, and a way of workers having a say-so in the way that things are accomplished. Bernie talks about having 20% of all stock owned by the employees of that particular company, and having a 45% presence of the employees on the board of directors of these corporations. And I think that would give us a voice. In the past, there's been this token thing where we said, yeah, we deserve to have a seat on the board. But when you're talking about a 10 or 20 person board with one sole labor person, they're going to be drowned out. It's just, and I want to see us have something real and sincere.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I guess a couple questions come to mind from that as I'm thinking through that. I guess firstly, what's the best argument you could imagine for somebody saying, no, Dan, let's assume somebody reasonable, well-intentioned, who says, Dan, I hear what you're saying, but let me explain to you why that's not a good thing. Why having workers, having stock ownership or being seated on the board, that's actually not the best way to go. Is there an argument that you've heard that makes sense on that side?
Great idea, because that's why they went to a 401k plan, because it gives employees an incentive to see the stock rise of their own company, because now they've got an actual real stake in the future success of that company. So corporations are part of that argument also. So it's just a matter of how much and when.
But do you think there is, so I guess to play that back, so is what you're saying, there really isn't, and it might be true, right? I'm not trying to lead the witness here. Right. Is there really no good argument to say the current system or the current structure, and I'll just use what you most recently said, about the stock ownership and the board seats. Is there no argument that says there's actually there's a logic or a benefit to keeping it the way it is, or more in line with that?
Well, to tell you the truth, actual socialism calls for seizing the means of production. That's a big phrase in there with socialism. But frankly, I'm afraid that I wouldn't want to run the phone company where I used to work, because there's too many things that can go wrong, and you don't have all the answers. I'm an expert at the shop level, and I can handle things at my level, but I wouldn't necessarily feel right running the company.
So does that, I'm just following the logical thread here. So is that something that says there is a natural order to it then? For those that are willing to take that responsibility and take on that, running the company and figuring out the big picture view of it, with that responsibility comes the power to make the decisions. Is there a natural order to it if you follow that logic?
Well, to some people there are, and that's on the corporate side. I had a group of a mastermind group, I guess you might call it, of folks that were going through my book chapter by chapter. One was a former head of the Toronto Stock Exchange. Another guy was former VP of IT at Disney. And then I had this lawyer who represents the interests of the country of Myanmar. And they all wanted to discuss my book chapter by chapter. And they said that the reason why CEOs make so much money is because it's their reputation that's on the line. They're the ones that are out there. But I countered with that with saying, you've got, for instance, the phone company. You've got somebody out there who's installing a phone line for a customer. They don't have any idea who the CEO is. That person, that installer, is the one who represents the company to them. So I think that that's a fallacy to say that the CEOs are that important. I don't see that being true at all.
How do you reconcile that, though, if somebody's listening to what you were saying before about, you wouldn't want to be in that position? You don't want to make those decisions. Is it just it's not better, it's just different types of decisions? Is that kind of what you would say to that? You're not saying that they're more powerful or more important necessarily. It's just a different skill set.
Exactly. Okay. The problem is we're overpaying for that skill set. And that's where we run into problems because, as I said, they're not any more valuable to the organization than your customer-facing employee.
Got it. Okay. And I guess last question on this thread. I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you say to the argument of if it were meant to be different, it would be, right? Like it worked out this way because this is the way that works, or whatever you want to call it, right? So saying that another way, if the labor pool, the workers should have more power, or there's a problem in the system in the way it works now, it should be able to be solved. The workers should be able to do something about it themselves to fix it and address it. If that's not happening, if that can't happen, then that speaks to the fact that this is the way that it should be.
Exactly. I mean, from what I understand, this is still true, that the assembly lines of car manufacturers here in this country, they're allowed to shut down the line if they find some consistent piece that's not being done right. They have that capacity to shut it down. And I think that's all we're all asking for. I think is to have a say-so in our own destiny, where we work and how we handle that. My job, when I worked at the phone company, I was a technician. And we used to say that we're not paid for what we do, we're paid for what we know, because for the most part, the phone company runs right along without you because it's practically all machinery now. But when something grinds to a halt, you need to have the knowledge to go in there and fix it. And so you're basically standing by waiting for something to go wrong. And a lot of jobs are like that.
But if someone were to say, like, if it were meant for the workers to have more power, then that should play out, right? If logic, right, kind of big L logic dictated that for businesses to be most successful, for them to run the way they should run, the workers are critical to that, which I agree with personally, by the way, right? Then it should play out that way, where if the workers aren't happy, if the system isn't working, it should grind to a halt because they're that important and they should have that power. The fact that it hasn't, the fact that it keeps humming along this way, it's not to say that it's perfect, but somebody can make an argument that says that seems to be a proof that there's an effectiveness to it, there's an efficiency to it.
Well, that's another one of the issues I deal with in the book is technology. Technology has thrown a monkey wrench, if you know the metaphor, into the whole way that we deal with those kinds of issues. And one of the things I had to do as a union president was I had to balance this fine line between complaining about something and actually trying to work with the company, because there are a lot of issues that came up, but my fellow leaders in the union said, don't make waves because that job can go away at the flip of a switch due to technology. So that's one of the issues I address in the book is the impending issues and problems that technology is going to hand to us.
Sure. And that's interesting too in and of itself. I mean, how did you think about those decisions when you ran into those? Like, what was the framework you used to determine, do I address this one, or is this just, because people complain, we all do it, right? There's sometimes our issues aren't really warranted. How did you make that distinction? That's a big responsibility.
Yeah, I felt that I would rather deal with the issue in a very militant sort of way rather than dying the death of 1,000 cuts.
Makes sense. So maybe that's a good segue too. Let's step back for a second, because we kind of jumped right into the views in the book, and which I think is great. If you step back and you start to think about how you started to form these views, how you started to come to some of these conclusions, we can go back as far as makes sense. But when did you start to come to some of these realizations? Were you always somebody who thought in kind of a somewhat of a social way that, we should all be in it together and be working towards the same thing? Was that something your parents raised you with? Or have you changed your views over time?
I've changed my views over time. When I hired on to the phone company in 1973, back in the dark ages, things were a lot different. It was very authoritarian, but we had a family atmosphere because it was a monopoly, and there was no threat from outside until MCI in 1984 said that they wanted to get into the long distance market, and they were being kept out of it by the company. So they filed a lawsuit against AT&T, and they didn't live long enough to see it actually come to fruition that long distance was all of a sudden open up to everybody. And all of a sudden we had to deal with the issue of competition. And a lot of us were not equipped for that. And we were entering strange new waters that we knew nothing about. So it's been a learning experience. And and I came along with that. A lot of my awakening, so to speak, came when Reagan was elected president. And a friend of mine was an air traffic controller, and he said, he showed me this letter from Reagan saying that I understand your problem. Help me get elected, and I'll help you take care of it. And air traffic controllers have always been quasi-military, very conservative in their viewpoints. So they jumped on the Reagan bandwagon, got him elected, and then he fired them all summarily. And that's created the whole thing about downsizing. And then you're not being fired, you're being downsized. So then labor didn't know what to do because they didn't know how far he would take it as with other labor groups to get rid of them. So it all became very hush-hush.
Yeah. So is it fair to say, as you're explaining that, so prior to Reagan being elected, were you in support of capitalism? Did you just not think about it much and kind of just felt like, well, it's the system we have, seems to be working? Like, what was your view prior that eventually that changed?
I just felt like I was a cog in the wheel. I had actually I'd grown up poor, and moved to Denver and lived with my grandmother, and my great grandfather. I didn't know what the middle class was like. They put me in that, and I got this job at the phone company. All of a sudden, I was making decent pay, and I could just start thinking about things outside survival. That's when I was able to start thinking about things like what's the right system for the worker, what's going to be best for society in general, and that was my awake moment, I guess you might say.
Yeah, for sure. So based on that, then, kind of growing up poor, as you said it, growing up in that way, that probably was very real to you at a very young age. Just even if you couldn't conceptualize capitalism or economic systems or any of that, was there a general sense of like, this doesn't seem fair, this seems wrong, that I just have to focus so hard on survival because I see other people that don't seem to have to do that?
Yeah, my dad took me aside because I used to read books like crazy, and I was a writer even back then. And he said, you have to learn the fact that you're poor, you're always going to be poor. You need to learn to work with your hands. And thank goodness I didn't listen to him. Do
you remember when he told it to you, what your thought was at that time?
He was trying to, I understood that he was trying to steel me for what my life was going to be like, because that's all he could see from his point of view. And but later on, he said he was proud of me because I got involved in the labor movement. And I helped people, and that's the whole reason why I did it, because I wanted to show that workers deserve dignity and respect.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing, because I always find this interesting when people tell stories about something like that. Like, I remember my dad said this to me when I was a child, trying to kind of remember the mindset you were in at the time, and kind of, I always think of things in terms of math. So like, I think our minds are always running some calculation to determine, like, is my dad right? Is my dad wrong? So it's just interesting to me to think about, as you think about the calculation your mind was running at the time, it sounds like what you're saying is, even at that age, do you remember around what age you were at the time when he said that to you?
Probably 11 or 12.
11 or 12. It sounds like what you're saying is, like, somewhere in your mind, it was calculating that and saying, like, something he's saying isn't right. That's an interesting thing, that even at that age, you were able to identify that.
Well, it's funny, about the same time I decided to get a summer job, and I worked on this shrimp boat with this old character, and we would go out and drag the nets through the bay and collect shrimp. And he, when we got back in, he fired me, and he said, you asked too many questions. He said, you need to be behind a desk. I was 12 years old.
That's a good thing, though. That's a compliment, right?
Yeah, I asked too many questions.
So you've always been kind of a questioner. You've always been somebody that's seeked answers to things. Is that something you think that you were born with, or was that something that you picked up from a parent or family or some influence?
Well, I learned to read when I was 5, and I read a dictionary. And I would quiz my mother on certain words, and I would roll my eyes when she didn't know what the word meant. I guess I've always been that way.
Always been that way. Yeah, that's good. That's great. I wonder too, have you ever thought about this? Because I think about, so I grew up, I should say, in probably a traditional middle class family. So I was in the 80s. I was a kid of the 80s, so around the Reagan time. But I grew up kind of probably taking the middle class for granted, that, hey, the system seems to work. Everything, I'm pretty comfortable. We weren't rich by any means, but most of the things I wanted, I had, and all that type of stuff. So obviously that I grew up through that lens and that perspective. You grew up in a different setting, right? Maybe less economically well off. Do you ever think about the roll of the dice that is life? Had you been raised in a family that was middle class or wealthy, do you think you still would have came to the same conclusions? Or do you think because of that, you would have felt like, well, no, the system seems pretty good. You know what I mean? Like, whereas given where you started, it was more obvious for you to come to the conclusion that something's off here. This system doesn't seem to work.
Well, that leads to the question of college, because I couldn't afford to go to college. And eventually my company offered tuition aid. So then I was able to go to college, and things sort of fell into place for me there. That sort of backed up all the things that I'd been led down the road to believe. And I thought, well, what if I'd gone to college right out of high school? Would I be the same person that I am today? And I don't believe I would have been. People that don't go to college walk around strutting and saying, I don't need to go to college. I'm a graduate of the School of Hard Knocks. But what they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
To quote Don Rumsfeld.
Well, could you? And I think that's super insightful. And I wonder if you can apply that same thing to, as a kid growing up poor, if there's a similar, call it what you will, chip on your shoulder or what have you, that, hey, this I didn't enjoy. This wasn't enjoyable, or this wasn't fair, whatever you want to call it. Therefore, almost by definition, I'm against this system. I'm predisposed to think this system is wrong. And therefore, maybe the assessment of it isn't as objective. And again, I'm not implying that your assessment is wrong. There's a lot that we could say capitalism is wrong. It's really more the thought exercise. Have you ever thought of it in that way, that maybe you haven't assessed it as objectively for that same reason?
There's probably, I think that we all come to these decisions based on our own experiences and based on the things that we've been taught. So I think, I think our conclusions may be foregone for ourselves, but and that's why it's important to have these kinds of conversations, because you see other people's perspective and you realize that, gee, maybe I was wrong about that, but here's why I was right about part of it, and we all learn from each other, right?
Yeah, and that's in many ways what I'm trying to do with this show is in some small way to do that, frankly, selfishly for myself, because I see the value in that, and I want to continue to challenge myself and get different perspectives.
To tell you the truth, that's why writers write. It's to lay things out before their own eyes, to say, well, gee, is this what I really think? And to test all those theories that you've built up over your lifetime.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but it's so easy from the outside. So take you as an example, where if somebody's, super conservative or super strong supporter of capitalism, they look at you and say, well, he wrote this book and he's got these views, and look at the title of the book, and they say he's clearly he's clearly biased and he's clearly dogmatic in his views. But there's something to be said for the fact that, like, hey, you put it down on paper and put it out there, knowing that now you've opened yourself up. So in many ways, the courage it takes to do that, the open-mindedness it takes, the humility it takes to say, hey, here's my view. I'm going to put it out there so I can get reactions to it, and I want it to be responded to. I don't know that enough people think of it in that way.
Yeah, I sometimes do get negative reactions. I can pretty much tell which political party a person belongs to when I hold up my book and they see the title. They'll either make a face or you're right about that, a knowing nod. But it's interesting because I was on a plane and the book was still being formed, and I was talking to this lady sitting next to me because she was letting me use her battery to charge my phone. And so I started telling her about the book, and she says, well, I'm Republican. And I said, well, here's I handed her my phone. And I said, here's a chapter. Why don't you read this chapter? And she read it, and she said, I want this book. Because it was a chapter about giving up our rights to have oversight of our politics and our politicians. And she found stuff that she can identify with in there. And I think that I forgot where I was going with this.
Well, I guess it's the open-mindedness, and like what you're trying to do is spur the conversation, right?
Putting myself out there, and
Yeah.
people do criticize it. I say, write your own damn book then.
Sure. Right. Yeah, sure. In that situation with that woman, like what do you, again, what I was saying before, this is what I'm always fascinated in how people think and how they come to their views and conclusions. Based on the conversation you had with her, like what do you think she was missing before reading that chapter? Was it ignorance? Was it she just never was introduced to the information? Was it denial?
I think it was complacency. I think she had never challenged herself on her beliefs. It was more of her husband, and she was just following along. Because, frankly, a lot of people would not like to deal with politics at all. They want things to just run smooth and, excuse me, not have to worry about their congressman's voting records on certain things. And that's too bad. We need to teach civics again in school.
Yeah. Well, you're hitting on an important point too that I talk about and think about a lot is that, there's some natural human nature to want things to be simple. And I think that's logical, right? Things are better when they're simple. It's easier. It takes less energy. It takes less time. All that. Yeah. So it makes sense that we strive for that. But unfortunately, particularly when you talk about economics and all that, it's not simple. And I think a lot of the times, to your point, that's what it gets to. People just, it's too hard. It's too much work. And they wish it could be simpler. So in their minds, they just decide it is. And capitalism is the way to go, or whatever it is, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So how do you think about that when, back to the beginning of the conversation in terms of your objective, right? So we've talked a bit about your views and maybe where they came from. So to your objective, it's to try and convince people, I'll use that word, so understand that there's a better way, there's a better system, some of the risks in the current system. How do you think about achieving that objective? Getting people that either don't know that or think the exact opposite. What's the way to get them bought in? Because I'm sure a lot of people bought your book that already agree with you, and that's great and that's good. And I'm sure they learned from it too. But to your objectives point, you're really trying to reach those people who might not naturally buy your book. So how do you think about that kind of approach?
That's why I wrote a study guide to go with it. One of the things I want to do is I want to get into union halls and have these discussions, because the way my study guide is written is for an open conversation. It's not being dogmatic about what I wrote in the book, the facts and all that. It's about how do I feel? How do I tell my friends that I'm a union member, or do I just sort of avoid that part of the conversation because it really has no relevance to my life? If it doesn't have any relevance to my life, why am I in a union? It starts a whole big conversation about some very important issues, I think. And I think that the way that we're going to get better at this is by having those conversations.
What have you found to be most effective to get people to open up to have those conversations or to even read the book? Are there things in terms of approaches of what you've said to them, or the way you've communicated it, or the context in which you've done it that have been more effective?
To tell you the truth, I trolled a lot of Facebook, especially when Trump was in office. And I would engage people in these conversations, but I really wanted to have a conversation. I didn't want to just badmouth Trump and move on. I wanted to say, well, why do you believe this? And what's wrong with this? Or what's right about this? And because I wanted to understand, because believe me, it didn't make any sense to me at all. Why people were backing this sort of all over the place way of administrating our country. So
yeah, how did that go? Did you get some good input? Did you get some good conversation?
Yeah, I've had testimonials, so to speak, that say while we might not ever agree, I like the fact that you're willing to have those conversations and willing to treat me with respect rather than immediately start bad-mouthing me because I back this guy.
So do you think that was the key? Was it the not bad-mouthing seems like an obvious one, although for many people it's not, right? They still lead with that. But do you think there was some degree of, was it empathy? Was it humility? Was it curiosity? What do you think they were picking up on that made them feel like this is a safe place to have this conversation and engage?
Humility, I'd say, because I would grant them small concessions. You're right about that, but look at this, and that's the way I did it. I could win the war.
Yeah. No, I get that. And it's. I think that's true. I think I found that too in my conversations, that humility is probably the biggest factor, and it's at least my experience. It has to be genuine for most people. They can sense, is it genuine humility or is it fake humility?
Right.
So that genuine willingness to entertain the idea of, hey, maybe you know something I don't know. Maybe you've thought about something a way I haven't thought about it. And my goal is to get to a better place. So if you have something that's going to help me get there, great. Like, to your point, I'm not dogmatic to a certain thing. I want people to be better off. I think you're right. I think people sense that, and it definitely helps a lot.
Yeah. It may not affect that person that you're talking to, but as you know, there are people reading over your shoulder everything you write. So that person that's sitting on the fence may decide that, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about. I'm going to go this way.
So true. It's so true. And it gets back to this podcast in and of itself. Like, my hope for this podcast is that, people that are listening to it, maybe they do sit on one side of this, but being able to hear and watch two people have a conversation that's not geared around trying to win or prove you wrong or prove me right, but just, hey, let's explore this and let's see that somebody maybe is looking over our shoulder and says, oh, interesting. Maybe I could do that too. And maybe I should look into this thing that I didn't want to look into before. I should read the book about capitalism that I wouldn't have read otherwise. That's kind of my hope in it.
Yeah. There's during the writing of the book, I had a section on the environment versus labor. There's some burning issues that go way back to the whole thing about the spotted owl. And so I contacted this labor guy in Geneva, Switzerland, to see how Europe was handling this situation. And he practically wrote the whole chapter on that. And he said that tell your audience in the book that you're dealing with America's issues. We're dealing with them in a totally different way. So after realizing that, actually, I've taken the book to Thailand, to Italy, to also Morocco, and I'll be walking through the airport with it in my hand, and people will say, "That's just like it is here." So
yeah, it resonates.
The book going to be in Italian and things like that.
Yeah.
So I come up with a sequel called "Capitalism Kills," the Global Edition, where I compare Norway, France, Morocco, and Thailand, because I'm familiar with the way they treat workers, to find out what it is that makes a particular country successful and their working class successful, based on how they're treated within the system. So I found some interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it doesn't surprise me that it resonates globally, because I think you're talking about, in many ways, like just human issues, right? Just people, human rights issues that we're talking about. I have to ask, so the title of the book, obviously when you're writing a book and you're selling a book, there is a marketing aspect to it. So I'm sure there's some of that at play, but as you made the title, it's a provocative title. It's a declarative title. How did you think about that? Did you think, hey, this may turn some people off? Did you think, this is how I feel, so I'm saying it? What was the thought process on the title?
No, it's we tried to make it look like a murder mystery, but rather than being a whodunit, it's a howdunit. So that's why I have all the dead bodies in chalk outlines, and then that provocative title. So the whole point was to make it look like a mystery and not necessarily an academic type book that you would.
I like that a lot. That's a cool concept.
Right.
Did you worry at all, though, that some people that you think need the book most might never read it because the title, they would feel like, oh, it's just another crazy liberal who's bashing capitalism? Did you worry about that at all?
Sure, but what I'm trying to do, I'm not necessarily trying to market to them. I'm trying to market to people that are going to take this book and say, I could do something with this. And so I'm targeting labor folks and millennials, because millennials, they throw out the playbook that we always use, and they're doing things in a different way that says labor unions are a no-brainer. They make total sense. This is the way I'm going to be able to secure my future.
Got it.
All that. They get it on a very instinctive level.
That's interesting, and that's an interesting distinction. So, is it fair to say what you're saying is that the audience for the book, to the objective you started with in the beginning, it's not necessarily people who think the opposite of you, that you're trying to get them to see some flaws in their thinking or mistakes. It's people who are either in the middle or supportive of what you believe, but just don't know what to do with it, and you're trying to help them figure it out. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, I call my book Chomsky Light.
Okay. Okay. I like that.
Down the path saying, oh, well, this is the way things used to be, and this is where we're headed. What are you going to do about it?
Got it. Okay.
We don't have all the answers. There's somebody out there, though, with some answers.
That has the answers. Okay. I get that. That makes sense. So let me go philosophical for a second again,
Sure.
on this kind of logical thread. So if you play that out, what you're saying is, I think there's some views you have, some things, some conclusions you've come to that say the world would be better if X, Y, and Z. And there's a group of people who generally agree with that, or maybe don't understand it well enough. And the book is for them so that they can understand it better and then take some action to get X, Y, and Z to happen and make the world a better place, which I think makes sense. Now, in this kind of scenario, there's another group of people who disagree with you, who say, you've got it wrong, at varying levels, but there's people that disagree. From a philosophical perspective, this is something I always struggle with. So I'm curious your take. How do you balance that? Because you could see somebody saying what you're doing is you're telling people who think differently, who want things to be a certain way and they're happy with how things are. You're wrong, I'm right. We're going to kind of bypass you or ignore you or overpower you, whatever you want to say, to change things in the way that I know it needs to be. Now, you may be totally right in what it needs to be, but given that it's so complex and it's so nuanced, how do you get the conviction and the confidence to do that? And do you ever question and say, this feels like I'm just forcing something that other people don't agree with?
No, they talk about, I've taken a lot of writing classes. And this one teacher said that there are three types of writers. There's the authoritarian that knows everything. There's the one who knows nothing and is just going to lay it out for you. And then there's the person that's called a Sherpa, who's the guide, who has been there and he knows the way and he wants to take you along so you can discover this stuff for yourself. And I think that's the role I play, is as the Sherpa. So I don't have the answers, like I said, but hopefully I've laid a case out for you to where you will be inspired to think about the subject and to actually come up with some answers yourself.
That makes sense. I mean, I could push it, and I will, just because that's what I do. Because I'm projecting on you a little bit, but even that concept of the Sherpa, there's an inherent aspect of that, which is that for you to show them the way, you know the way, right? They don't, you do.
Presumption, yes.
There's some presumption in that, right? Now, for the world to go round and for there to be positive change in the world, somebody has to do that. So I get that on a logical level. But on the individual level, what made you feel like, yeah, I am a Sherpa in this. I do have the right information that people need. Because you balance that with the humility we talked about before, right? That's a tough balance to strike. And you're doing it well, but
I guess what I was trying to do was the book also says this is what happened and this is what I took from it. This is what happened. This is what I took from it. And so it builds my case as it goes along.
Got it.
I don't just make it about myself. I quote Time magazine. I quote somebody named Michelle Alexander who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow. And I put all this stuff together to sort of back up my theories and all that, because I know, again, I'm not the authority on all these subjects.
Yep. I like that. There's a concept I told you, I always think of things in terms of math. So I think of it like, you remember we used to take, tests in high school, math tests, and the teacher would say, you have to show your work. You can't just give me the answer. I need to see the work and I'll grade that. Yeah. It sounds like that's kind of what you're getting at, that in the book, there's an acknowledgement of, listen, I don't know that I'm right, but I'm going to show you my work and I'm going to show you why I think I am. And then you'll make your decision off of it. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
That's in a nutshell. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So how far would it go? Like, as you sit here today, can you envision a scenario a year from now, 5 years from now, whatever it is, where you say, shoot, you know what? I didn't realize this. I do think capitalism in some form is the way we should go. Is that at all a possibility in your mind?
No, I can tell you why. Since Biden got elected, all these people are coming out of the woodwork that were afraid to say anything while his predecessor was in office. And we're seeing this moment of now. Now is our moment when we can accomplish so much, like the PRO Act. And I mean, there's all sorts of things that are being lined up to go in and change things back the way they were before that travesty was elected. And also to better our predicament, the workers' predicament, all that kind of stuff. And I'm seeing this whole, I guess they call it a gestalt, where all these groups and things are coming together. Someone named Jane McElvaney, who wrote 3 books, that I stumbled on her thanks to a friend, and it's almost like she read my book and then wrote hers. And so I see all these things coalescing into a moment that we can actually change things, and it's so exciting that I'm part of that. I wish I was out front of that, but I'm willing to at least take part of the credit for thinking that working people can be in the driver's seat.
Sure. What would you say if to somebody that says, so Biden in office, definitely the positives you're saying for sure. But ultimately, Biden still, at least I think on paper, supports capitalism. So we're still dealing with the capitalist system. So all the improvements you're saying, that's happening within the system that we think is toxic and the one that we should change.
Well, even FDR said, said to labor, he said, "You got me elected. Now make me do what you want me to do." So
there's the difference between getting elected and what you have, and then once you're there, what you can actually do. Exactly.
So, and Biden, you're right. He was not my first choice. Bernie was my first choice. I love Bernie, and he's turned a lot of these issues that were so-called radical left-wing ideas into considerations by the Democratic Party and the nation as being something. Yeah, that's something I want to see: a $15 an hour minimum wage, a tuition-free college, and a Medicare for all system. All these ideas make sense, and they will make life so much better for the average person.
So what is your mindset? I mean, you can take this question how you want to, if you want to kind of be specific or more high level, but $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, healthcare for all, the different things that you're talking about. What's your thought to the people, again, the reasonable, well-educated, well-intentioned people who just disagree? They think $15 minimum wage is going to hurt businesses. It's going to cause inflation or whatever, right? Universal healthcare is going to stifle innovation, and it's going to make it harder to get good healthcare treatment, whatever it is. So again, you could respond to that specific to the issues and say, well, let me explain why those are right. But I think what I'm a little more interested in is, how do you think about those people, right? Like if they're not bad people, but they just come to a different conclusion, what's the right way to handle those people? Like what's the right way to think about them in that situation?
That's a really good question. And if I had the answer to that, I wouldn't need to
solve all the problems, right? Yeah, it's true.
But no, I think that it's what I think it was Adam Smith that called it the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to do is to share those ideas, because you're right. Maybe I'm not totally right. Maybe I've got some things wrong here. But if I don't have a dialogue with somebody who's at least semi-diametrically opposed, then we may not come up with the best solution. That's somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And it's hard, right? It's easy to say mostly, but to actually do it is tough. And you've touched on it a few times, so I'll go there a little bit. Obviously, our last president was pretty polarizing, and there was lots of strong views about him. And it was very easy during that time to feel like, whether it be hatred, anger, vitriol, not only for him, but the people that supported him. And I get that in many ways. how did you find yourself dealing in that situation? Was it that? Did it start to feel very much like, hey, this is just evil that we're dealing with here, or did you see it differently?
Well, he did a couple of things right, but I think he did it without realizing that it was right. He did it out of a personal prejudice or point of view, and like the throwing out NAFTA, that was a great idea. I don't know how the news situation is looking. I haven't. It hasn't been around long enough to see the fallout from it, because we already lost those 5 million manufacturing jobs under NAFTA. Thank you, Bill Clinton. So I don't think a lot of ways that I dealt with him was by trying to ignore what he was putting out there, because otherwise you wake up every day and you get frustrated 20 times a day because of all the tweets that are coming out.
Yeah.
So all you could do is hope that the ship of state would right itself. And in fact, I mentioned that in the book, because a lot of the book was written during that election 2016, and there's a lot of things in there that I have to say sound kind of prescient now, because I said the ship of state will right itself, and that's what has happened. Some people may not think so, but yeah, it was a terrible time for me and a lot of my friends, but if we don't hold Biden's feet to the fire, we may slide back into a lot of things that we didn't particularly like. He's one of the things that I discussed with my labor friends was, look what he's doing here and there with Trump, that is. Mm-hmm. And we all realized that it was going to take decades to get back to where we were on some issues that had happened before. For instance, the emission standards on cars. He threw that out the window. And it was interesting because I was with the Teamsters when we talked about that issue with the Environmental Protection Agency. We lobbied them in Washington, D.C. And they said, well, we don't want 50 standards of emissions for every state. We would like one standard. And California's looks good. We're going to go with California's, which is the strongest against emissions. So I was very happy to see that Obama's administration liked that idea.
Yeah, I get it. It's tricky, and where I found it tricky as well is in the interpersonal relationships. You know, I don't know your situation, but if you had any friends or family who were avid Trump supporters at the time, that's where it got really interesting. Yeah, what was that?
I don't have that family anymore.
No, well, that's funny. That's where I was going to go. Like, how did that play out? Is that true? Like, is there people that you used to speak to who just you couldn't? You know, it just became, yeah.
One of my brothers hung up on me, and he hasn't talked to me since.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? And at the root of it, as comfortable as you are sharing, was it around economic policy? Was it just Trump in general? What was it? What was it?
This particular brother is I was going to say a gun nut, but let's just say he's a Second Amendment supporter. So that was his big issue. And I have another brother who was big on the fact that he seemed to be pro-Christian. And so he latched onto that. He was very smart about picking emotional issues that would raise emotions rather than deal with fact.
Yeah,
we are trying to deal with the facts, and they don't talk to each other.
It's interesting because it goes back to where we were a little bit earlier in the conversation, just the different, more personal kind of manifestation of it, of this idea of when you disagree with somebody, when somebody has a different view and you run into that situation, and exactly like you're saying, implicit or inherent in that is a view of like, they're wrong and I'm right. Like they just, my brother just doesn't get it, and he should see it the way I see it. And the reason I struggle with that, aside from just trying to maintain that balance of humility, is like an effectiveness perspective. Is it the most logical? Is it the most rational? Is it even if you do think you are right? I think we should all be open to the idea that, the smartest people in the world at one point thought the earth was flat and they were wrong. So everything we think we're right about, we should never be 100% certain, and you've said that too, right? Yeah. But furthermore, is it actually going to make the situation better to just write that person off or disagree with them? I'm not saying you did that in this case, but you get what I'm getting at. Like,
Yes.
How do you think about that?
Well, because I've studied politics so much, I'm actually a delegate to the state Democratic Party. I've studied the issue since I first got politically involved back in the late 70s, early 80s. And I told my brothers, please don't vote for this man, because even if you disagree with me fundamentally on the issues, have some respect for the fact that I've done my homework and I know the issues in and out, and I've studied them enough to know what I'm talking about. So give me some credence there. And
They didn't.
no, it was emotional issues again.
Yeah. And I wonder, again, I say this totally respectfully, I'm just exploring.
Sure.
I wonder if there's not a part of that where they said it had like the opposite effect, where it felt condescending to them, or there felt like there was a degree of arrogance there of, oh, you think you're smarter than me. You think you know better. Do you worry about that at all? That might have came off that way?
Yeah, I guess I took privilege from the fact that I'm the oldest brother.
Okay. That should count for. I was the youngest, so I appreciate that privilege. I've always admired that privilege.
I was pulling rank.
No, it's interesting, and Dan, I'll say as we come to the end here, I think what I enjoy about these conversations, and this one in particular, is the openness and the willingness. I always say it is like the walls coming down. To me, those are the best conversations where people are just authentic, and we're not worried if our answers are right or wrong in an unhealthy way. We're worried in a healthy way, right? We want to make sure we're right. We want to challenge ourselves, but we're courageous and kind of confident and authentic enough to say, like, hey, here's what I was thinking at the time. And maybe you'll tell me something that says I'm wrong. And I appreciate that in this conversation, kind of that candor and that willingness to let the walls come down and share some of that. Because I think you're absolutely right. I think for us to get to a better outcome, whatever that outcome is, right? It might be what you're saying it is in terms of the right economic system. It might be something different. The only thing I think I know for certain is that for us to get there, we need to be able to really dissect it and explore it and share these views and be able to communicate on it. And I think what you're doing, these podcasts, the book, are contributing to that. So I appreciate that for sure.
Thanks, Terry. And I'd like to offer a free copy of my book signed by me to one of your listeners. You decide.
That would be awesome. Yeah, I'll put that in the notes for sure. I think that's a super cool idea. So yeah, I appreciate that a ton. And I should say, so for the listeners, obviously the book, Capitalism Killed the Middle Class, it's on Amazon. You can get it in most places. I think you would get books. But if they wanted to learn more about you, I think there's a YouTube channel as well. How can they find out more about you or get more of your content?
There's the YouTube channel. There's also something, well, it's a big mess. I'll just have to give you the link. There's a site called Hosting Authors, and it was developed by an author, and it's got everything you could possibly want to know about me and more on there. So because there's other books coming, including a novel, and that's one of the things that the coronavirus has been good to me for, because I've got this little office I sit in all day long, and my wife has been great to let me write all day long, and I'm putting out a lot of stuff on different websites and things like that. And yeah, I'm the expert on everything now. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And as we said before, like that's a big thing. I mean, it's not easy to write. Literally, it's not easy to write and to write a book. But it's also not easy to put it out there and deal with the criticism and the feedback. But I think what I'm hearing from you is that you believe there's benefit to it, and you're willing to do that, right? You're willing to make that sacrifice. You're willing to do that work because you think the end goal of it is worth it, and it's going to help people. And I think anytime your objective is to help people, it's hard to go wrong with that, right? If that's truly what you're after.
That's truly what I'm after. Thanks, Terry.
Yeah. Well, Dan, listen, I appreciate it so much. If I know you're working on a novel, some other books, maybe we'll have you on again when those come out. But for now, definitely check out Dan's book, and thank you for being on the show. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Terry.